What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at Marvel Snap's newest card, Bullseye. Hit or miss? I guess they never miss, huh? Bullseye is a 3/3 with an activate ability that discards all the cards that cost 1 or less from your hand and gives your opponent's cards -2 for each of them. So for each card you discard, one of your opponent's cards will get afflicted with -2 power. This means that this card has massive potential, both as an enabler for discarding cheap cards like Swarm and, of course, Daken's Blade, but also as a card that technically does real damage to your opponent's board. This card gets better the more cards your opponent has on the board, as long as you are able to discard more and more cards on your own. This makes it a very unique card when paired with various discards that cost 1 or less, such as a 0-cost Swarm or a 1-cost Scorn. This card is, however, fairly limited. This is only ever going in discard decks, and more than that, it is only ever going in discard decks that are very much built around doing this thing. What that means is that there's not a lot of room for interacting with your opponent in basically every deck Bullseye plays in, which makes him a deck that is vulnerable to getting numbers checked. This is the kind of card that is going to be around and good and relevant and will have decks that you can play with him in it, but it might not ever be the best deck in the game unless it is clearly the best method of outputting points, and I don't really know that we've seen enough of Bullseye for that to happen. He is a very specific card. This is not the kind of thing that you're going to be seeing a Bullseye package in your Wiccan deck. This is not what he does. What he does is go with other discard cards and increase their effectiveness, and in turn see his own effectiveness increased. Cards like Scorn and Swarm, of course, are very clear synergies with this guy. There are going to be a couple of commonalities across every single Bullseye deck. There aren't actually a ton of different things you can do with this guy. So when we jump into the section where we talk about decks, I really don't want to see any comments about how, oh, well, all of these decks use the same card. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of Frigga when you're using Bullseye, because there's going to be a lot of Daken when you're using Bullseye, and copying Dakens and copying the shards can be an incredibly relevant thing to do. This is going to be one of the things that you'll run into with this guy. He is limited, which means in terms of cards that you play with him, they tend to be specific and repeated across the decks in which he goes. He also is limited in a more general sense, which is to say the decks he requires you to play in order to optimize or even really use him are decks that need you to invest in discard, which means that you are not going to be able to interact with your opponent profitably. As an example, I'd like you to consider discard as a deck that has the ability to, let's say, put 20 power in every lane consistently. Now, that deck does seem very strong. If you're putting 20 power in every lane consistently, that's a really strong thing to do. But there are worlds in which there are other decks that are reliably putting 30 power in 2 lanes, and those are not decks you have a way of actually dealing with. That is ultimately what discard runs up against. There's only room for the best points deck in a given metagame, and discard is a very good one, but I'm not convinced that it ends up being the best. It also has a second axis on which it has to compete, which is the best points deck that doesn't get interacted with meaningfully. On this axis, it's very often competing with move bounce, and that means that it is very often coming out second place to move bounce, because move bounce is better at not being interacted with. Discard stuff can get very strong. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it can't. But the thing you're going to want to keep in mind for Bullseye specifically is whether or not you think that this will be the best way of doing non-interactive points. We've had a lot of conversations about verticality. If you think Bullseye discard is the single best way to go vertical in a given metagame, that is the use case in which it can be the best deck in a given metagame. I do not believe that it has hit that point, but it does seem relatively playable. The issue is, once the novelty wears off, are people still going to be playing this on its own merits? And that I'm a little less sure of. Frigga's rise in the metagame recently has been a remarkable one, and it's one of those things where once people see how a card can be applied in certain cases, they start to see similar cases for that everywhere. When you look at what Frigga can do in terms of being a force multiplier on cards that can get very large, you can see how easily it applies to cards like Morbius or cards like Daken that can get into the double digits very easily, and you would very much love having multiples of those cards. For this reason, this is actually the most popular Bullseye deck in top 10% Infinite. It's using Frigga to double up on the unique and interesting things that Bullseye can do. Discarding extra cards, creating more of Daken's little shards, and making larger Morbiuses, or at least making multiple Morbiuses. The thing that this deck runs into is a thing that basically all of these decks run into. You have maybe a couple of pieces of interaction. Bullseye is one of them, and Gambit is another. Interestingly, both of them throw playing cards. The real thing that this deck doesn't have, though, is any sort of specific targeted interaction. Any interaction is going to be, well, I'm going to apply some negative power to your stuff and hope that that works, or, well, I'm going to try to blow something up and hope that that works, and that is fine. It's better than having nothing, but it's not necessarily real interaction in the same way that something like a Shadow King would be, right? Decks like this don't have the ability to play tech. And because they don't have the ability to play tech, they have to rely on the tools they do have the ability to play in order to beat decks that can consistently go as tall or taller than them. Examples being Mr. Negative, examples being Move Bounce, stuff like that is sort of the worry here when you play a deck like this. You're going in for a strategy that is basically saying, I'm going to be very large, I'm going to make a lot of points, and you are going to have less points than me. This is a metagame where there are a lot of decks that are very capable of just saying, I don't care. I am going to play a 0-6 Gore and a 0-3 Mystique, and none of what you're doing is going to matter. And there's a lot of stuff like that right now. Again, it's not that this deck is bad. It's definitely an improvement on what this deck has been able to do previously, and it's probably the first time Daken's actually been a serious, reasonable consideration in any of these archetypes at all. In fact, the fact that Daken is such a popular piece of these decks is something that I genuinely didn't expect to happen. I expected a lot of slap Bullseye in the Apocalypse deck stuff, and it seems that Bullseye has actually gone and sort of started a splinter of the normal discard list, which I find amazing, because Daken doesn't really have room in the normal discard list, but if you're able to build around Bullseye, he actually does. And so what seems to be happening here is that discard is splintering a bit. There are these decks that lean further into Bullseye and weird stuff, and then there are the traditional Apocalypse decks, and right now, they're performing at about the same level, which means that instead of this card juicing the Apocalypse decks, taking it to a level that may be able to compete with the move bounces of the world, what's actually happened is it's created a second alternate build that is at about the power level of the Apocalypse decks. If you don't have Frigga, I have seen people having success with the Zola version of the previous build. It is not as directly absurd. It requires maybe a little bit more work, a little bit more things that you're going to need to catch your opponent off guard by, but you can do fairly similar things in terms of doubling up on your big boys here. This is not the kind of thing that is always going to work, but it is nice to know that when push comes to shove, you have the ability to do something like play your Daken out, clone the shard, discard that, then you have your little guys out there, you Zola on the final turn of the game. After the Zola goes off, the Dakens put 2 more shards in your hand, and then you activate the Bullseye, and then those shards get discarded. Like, you can see where this is going, right? Like, this is a deck that is actually able to go vertical with the best of them. This can go extremely vertical when the things line up the way that they do, and there's real value in that in this metagame. Going incredibly vertical matters a lot. Like, it is a surprisingly important thing to do. And because you can go vertical in this way, because you have that built in, you get to beat up on decks that don't interact with you. There is something to be said about this. Like, there is a metagame right now that is conducive to just saying, no one's going to interact with me, it's fine, I'm good, until someone interacts with you and you lose 8 cubes. The Jimmy Dickens Helicarrier Bullseye deck is a very fun version of what is happening here. It gets to use things like Victoria Hands, so your swarms are 5 power, which is pretty sick. You have Helicarrier Collector. You get to generate a bunch of weird garbage. You get to discard a bunch of unique and weird cards and create a bunch of odd board situations. And because you're a Helicarrier deck, there's a little bit of Arishem in you, where like you're gonna have these games where you actually do just generate the right card and it does actually just blow your opponent out. And so you have this very reasonably good set of, here is a bunch of cards that just do good points. Like here's a bunch of stuff that's just great on rate, backed up by randomly generating some stuff. And I think that is a really reasonable place for this deck to be and for this archetype to be, because it's the closest this archetype can get to actually running tech. It won't actually always have tech, or even necessarily often have tech, but it'll have that little bit of doubt in your opponent's mind about what you're actually going to do post Helicarrier. Like, that does matter. It'll also have some larger collectors than many of these other lists. Like, this is a deck that is effectively a tempo-ish kind of deck. You play for good stats, then look for a blowout and see what you can do with your ridiculous stuff off of Helicarrier. You have Victoria Hand to buff all of it. She's also buffing your swarms. You have all the stuff that every other one of these decks has as well. Bullseye and Daken, great point package. There's power here. And I think it is worth talking about that in the context of this is as close as any of these decks can get to running interaction with your opponent, which is trying to randomly generate it off of Helicarrier. If you don't have Scorn, I know Derek has been doing very well with a build very close to this. Again, a lot of the ethos here is kind of the same. This is sort of like the fusion of these builds, basically. Not only are we doing the Helicarrier stuff, we also have the Daken stuff in here. We've got the Frigga stuff. We've got all the stuff that goes with Bullseye here. He does not own Scorn, but I would try to get Scorn in here. I think that would be a pretty easy swap in for the Grandmaster if you ask me, but maybe we're not a Grandmaster deck. Again, it sort of depends, because Grandmaster can reactivate Frigga, Grandmaster can reactivate Daken. That stuff does matter. There is some upside to that. Like, there's a lot of interesting stuff that this archetype that Bullseye has spurred into existence can do. And I think it's nice that a card like Daken is seeing as much shine as it is. I think it's nice that a card like Frigga is finally seeing some shine. This has really been the season of Frigga, honestly, and it's only continuing. This is a unique and interesting way to try to approach the problem of what this deck is supposed to do. This one, I think, has just the most power jammed into it once you get a Scorn in there. Again, this is sort of a budgetified version, but I do know that it was very successful for a very high-ranked player, and that is relevant information. There is something here. One of the things that these decks tend to be very good into is just like Wiccan stuff, because Wiccan stuff has a relative cap on how tall it can get, and so these decks very often are just outpointing it even through interaction, in as much as they have interaction. This has always sort of been the weakness of Wiccan, where it's like, when this deck is good, it is because that there are things that are policing the things that go over the top of it. Right now, there's really not a lot of stuff policing things going very tall, and so the things going very tall are in a very good position right now, and this is a deck that can definitely do that. Last up, the most boring of these lists by far, but if you ask me, it might be the one that actually manages to stick it out. Probably Bullseye's most guaranteed slot in is, of course, in traditional discard. I had higher hopes for this then ended up getting realized, to be honest with you. I thought that this could be an addition to traditional discard that would take it to a higher level of competition among the metagame. That doesn't seem to have happened. There might still be room for that to happen, but ultimately, when you play this deck as is, you get a strong sense of, like, not hopelessness or futility per se, but if you didn't do stuff to make your later cards good, it can feel a little bit weird, right? Like, if you have your Bullseye, but you also have your Dracula, and so it's like, okay, so I'm using the Bullseye in order to multiply on 5 after a MODOK in order to multiply my swarms. That's good, but it's like a 3/7, and you're like, okay, is that really all that worth it? Like, there's a bunch of really weird spots where, like, the card is very clearly good, but if you aren't able to get your swarms discarded, it loses a lot of its oomph in a list like this. I've thought about trying stuff like just putting Daken in for one of the 3s. I think that could end up making a lot of sense, but as is, I'm not overly convinced that using this build is an upgrade from the Malekith strong guy builds of the deck that were already popular. And losing out on Malekith really does impact you. Like, you're very much interested in getting to your Modok, and Malekith really does help do that. And so when I look at what I thought Bullseye could do, I think, I thought about that in the context of Bullseye being a flat addition, but it's not really an addition in the context of the Malekith Strong Guy deck, which is the strongest build of the deck. It's an alternate path. And because of that, it ends up sort of peaking at roughly the same place. I don't know, actually, if he ends up being required to play traditional discard or if you're just better off playing Malekith and Strong Guy. They're very, very good cards, and I don't really know that Bullseye is necessarily good enough to outdo any of them. So, overall feelings. The card seems strong, but not necessarily overly so. It seems like a powerful card in a specific archetype, and rather than taking that specific archetype and boosting it to the moon, it's rather done something that's a little bit more horizontal. It's taken the discard archetype and it's split it a little bit. And now they're all sort of peaking at the same point. Previous to this card coming out, Daken's stuff was not at this level. Daken's stuff was not at the level of Apocalypse stuff. Now it sort of feels like it might be. And the Daken package, I don't think it'll end up in Wiccan decks per se, but it is a little bit more splashable than anything else Discard has had in a very long time. It allows you more flexibility, not in terms of getting it into other decks, but of getting other packages into it. I don't necessarily know how long that'll go, but I do think that long term, there might actually be something here in terms of, especially the fourth deck I showed, once you get Scorn into that, suddenly we're looking at a really low to the ground, lean and mean point package that has a lot of ways to do a lot of different things. It can go tall when you need it to, it can go wide when you need it to, it can do a bunch of different things in a bunch of different ways. It has the unexpectedness of Helicarrier. I think there could be something there. I'm not saying there always will be something there, but I think there could be something there. And that is the kind of thing where I think there is still room to grow for Bullseye. Now, there is no OTA this week, as far as I know at least, and that means that I don't get to use my normal spiel of always wait because there's an OTA, so I'm going to go to spiel number 2, which is always wait just to see how things shake up. Because I have a feeling that while Bullseye is compelling and interesting, that it is not necessarily the kind of thing that's going to have staying power, barring balance changes to something like move bounce. This is a deck that does points very well. It goes very tall. Guess what? That already exists, and it gets the dodge priority. I'm not sure that this deck has the same flexibility and power as move bounce does. So in a world where Bullseye is not the flavor of the week, I'm not sure that it's going to stick around. I'm trying to do a little bit better at keeping an eye on that flavor of the week stuff. I feel like not necessarily that I've missed on evaluations because of that, but just because a card is strong doesn't mean that it's going to stick around. And when people want to buy stuff, they want to buy stuff that's going to stick around, that they know is going to be good, that they'll be able to invest in and spend time in, and generally get their money's worth from. And I think it is important to note that I'm fairly ambivalent on Bullseye actually being one of those cards. It's going to be one of those cards that, like, in order to play a certain type of deck, you're going to need, but whether that type of deck is good enough for you to want to invest in it, I think is kind of an open question. As always, I've been KM Best, you've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one. Have a wonderful day. Marvel Snap is back, and so am I. You have been phenomenal. I've been KM Best. Have a good one.